First on BBC One.
Well done, Paul. You are a star. I've done it again. Unbelievable. Okay, a few things have happened in the last 10 minutes, basically, that have kind of dishevelled me somewhat. A few unexpected things have turned up, so I'm sorry about that. Thanks, John of Tadley, for letting me know I'm on mute. Right, let's start all that again. So, this is episode 14 of the History CV of Britain. I am your host, Paul. Welcome to the show. Glad you can hear me. Okay, I was saying it's been a lovely sunshiny day today in Britain, and we didn't do a show last week. So, and since then the clocks have gone forward, so we're in the daylight for a change, which is lovely. But I'm not too sure how that's going to affect my lighting as we go on. We'll find out. Okay, Dr. Stephen Pidgeon is with us. He'll be joining us very shortly. I wanted to briefly mention a comment that I received this week that appeared on episode 2 of the History CV of Britain when I talked about the pagan god Isis. The comment was made by somebody called Pendrake. Thank you for that comment, Pendrake. It's a very lengthy comment, and I haven't had time to condense it down to show you. But basically, they were talking about the name Isis and what it means in the Welsh language, and then they added an I to the beginning of Isis to make it Iesos, and described what that meant in the Welsh, and it was absolutely fascinating. So more on that next week. The main reason why I'm telling you about this is because this is what this show is all about. It's an interactive show, and I love reading your comments either in the chat box or in the comment section underneath the video. So please do get involved, say hello, and share your thoughts and ask your questions in the chat box. Brilliant. Okay, right. One video to mention this week. Melissa Campbell of the Mercurial Pathways YouTube channel has published a video where she's interviewed a friend to this channel, Marcel Abrahams, on her book, The Great Migrations. It's a fantastic video. And I could never, ever get bored of listening to Marcel talk about history or the two great migrations. So please do give that a watch when you get a chance, and do subscribe to the channel because Melissa's doing some great work over there. Okay, I'm going to show you something very quickly, something that cropped up in my feed this week. So I'm going to share screen. Bear with me one moment. Here we go. Okay, so hopefully now I'll just double check that it's on the screen. Brilliant. Okay, So this came up in my feed this week, which I found very interesting for a number of reasons. Rare Merlin and King Arthur text found hidden in binding of medieval book. The extremely significant text was hidden for centuries. So I'll just pick out a couple of things here that are worth looking at. So variations on the classic Merlin and King Arthur legend spanned hundreds, if not thousands, of retellings. Many are documented within handwritten medieval manuscripts dating back over a millennia. Blah, 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 blah. There's a picture of it there. And what I wanted to show you mainly was this. Experts combined multiple conservation tools and techniques to construct a 3D model of the fragments. These included multispectral imaging, which creates high resolution images by scanning an artifact with wavelengths ranging from ultraviolet to infrared light. After borrowing X-ray and CT machines from Cambridge's zoology department, the team then examined the parchment layers to map unseen binding structures without the need to deconstruct the delicate material. CT scanning allowed researchers to examine how the pages were stitched together using thin strips of similar parchment. I just find all that absolutely incredible what they can do nowadays with these old documents. Absolutely mind-blowingly fascinating. It says here, if this had been done 30 years ago, the fragment might have been cut, unfolded and flattened. But today, preserving it in situ gives us a crucial insight into 16th century archival practices. It's dated to around 1275 to 1315 CE. And the original edition was written in Old French, which of course is the Normans. And here we have, so the first portion recalls the Christians' victory against the Saxons at the Battle of Cabignac, including a fight involving Gawain, his brothers and his father. Now, this is where I got lost a bit because I don't recognize these names. King Loth versus the Saxon kings Brandalus, Dodalis, Moidus, and Oriances. So there's some characters there that I haven't come across before. So let me know what you think about that in the chat box. And if you know any of those characters, please do fill me in because I haven't come across them before. But yeah, very, very interesting article there that came up this week. And it's fascinating what they can do these days with these old documents and parchments. Okay, let's stop sharing screen. And that's me, I'm back. And I'm not on mute. Wahey. Okay, right. One last thing before I bring on my guest. A quick update. Did I remember? I did. Look, I've done it. It's only taken me 14 episodes to master the reverse mirror imaging, but there you go. So I'm about 3/4 of the way through this book now, and I can assure you that this is every bit as good as its predecessor, The Holy Kingdom, written by the same author, Adrian Gilbert. Really, really good stuff. So it kind of kicks off about 3 or 4 chapters into the book when Adrian talks about being shown around a place called Margam Museum in Wales, where there's lots and lots of old stones. And Adrian noticed foliated crosses on some of these stones that looked very similar to Rosicrucian crosses. Now, the Rosicrucian movement happened at least, I think, 100 years after the Renaissance, whereas a lot of these crosses at the museum were like 1500 years old. So he starts to look into that to see if there's a connection, and there is. There is a connection between the 17th century Rosicrucian Brotherhood and whoever designed these flagstones. And so this leads us into the War of the Roses, of the Tudors, and John Dee and his circle of initiates. And it's really, really hotting up and getting very interesting. I've got about 50 or 60 pages left, so I should have that finished by next week. And Adrian is our guest next week on the History CV, so that should be really, really good. Right, okay. I don't think I've forgotten anything. Let me just double check before I bring on our guest. No, that's it. Okay, so please welcome everyone. He was with us on episode 11 of the History CV, and I really, really enjoyed that one. Fantastic stuff. And I've got some more questions for him this evening. So without further ado, here is Dr. Stephen Pidgeon. Hello, Stephen.
Hi, Paul. Good to see you again.
Yeah, you too. You too. Yeah, we had a brilliant response from your last appearance on the show. So I'm really glad you could join us again. I've got lots and lots of questions to ask you. Now, one of the things that you discussed with me in episode 11 was a story that took place around 500 years before the time of Christ. I think I'm getting that right. And it was the story of Jeremiah, the prophet, coming to Ireland with his scribe Baruch, if I remember rightly. Now, I looked into this and discovered that some scholars say that he came with an entourage that included, let me get the name right here, the daughter of King Zedekiah, who was called Tefi. And she supposedly founded a line of Davidic kings. So the official line on all this history is there's no evidence, blah, blah, blah. So I'm sure that isn't true. So what would you say are the best historical sources for researching Jeremiah's stay in Ireland?
Yeah, that's a great question. And when you talk about this, Paul, the question of research from something that is from 500 BC is, of course, going to be a very difficult topic to unveil because, one walk through a graveyard anywhere in Britain and you'll see that the rain has completely washed away the engraving on the stones. That most of the graves that are earlier than 1700 have nothing on them. They're just blank stones because the rain has washed it away. So you can imagine going back to 581 BC, how difficult the megaliths or hieroglyphs are going to be. So the research, and of course, there has been lots of damage done to any Irish research because of course, the persecution that came on the island, which has really been nonstop. There's been a series of genocides that have taken place on the island. The forced conversion into Catholicism in the 14th century. It did not happen during Patrick. It happened during the 14th century under Edward II. Then the forced conversion away from Catholicism under Henry VIII, and which was given a real tool of destruction under Oliver Cromwell in the 17th century. But the 16th and the 17th century resulted in really this: we're going to take you away from Catholicism that we forced on you 300 years earlier. Now we're going to take it away from you. And then when that was taken away, then of course there were the Ulster plantations of King James and so on and so forth. And for many, many years, Catholics in Ireland were criminalized for keeping any kind of text. They kept a book, particularly in the ancient Gaelic. If they had a text in the ancient Gaelic and they were found with it, well, they could be executed. So there was one of the practices that happened, and by the way, this was prior to the Emancipation, from the Edict of Henry VIII. I think it was in 1534, until we get to the Emancipation of 1837. The Catholic Irish were prohibited by law from maintaining birth certificate, death certificate, marriage certificate, baptism certificate. So anything that was being done in Ireland was being done privately, secretly, and they would maintain manuscripts in boxes buried in the peat somewhere. So there has, in Irish scholarship, there's been a lot of unveiling of manuscripts that were previously hidden. Now, of course, the question of these legends. For instance, there's a great poem on Tia Tefi that was unveiled from an ancient manuscript. Well, what's the date on the manuscript? Who knows? How recent was it? We don't know that either. But the key thing we have is we've got some major artifacts that do testify to Jeremiah being in Ireland. Okay. So the first testimony is in Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 10. And this is a very important testimony because it says that Jeremiah will be given the authority and the power to tear down nations and to replant them. So the question is, does that narrative discuss the replanting of Jerusalem? somewhere else, and I think it does. Now, so the historical evidence, I'll just point this out. One of the greatest, I think, historical megaliths in all of the British Isles is Jeremiah's tomb. And they call it Jeremiah's tomb. It sits upon a hill, I don't know, about 70 kilometers out of Dublin. And it's a mound, a burial mound. And as you know, I mean, Wales is full of burial mounds, but the burial
Mhm.
mounds in Wales are much more sophisticated. Jeremiah's tomb is probably the least sophisticated mound you might find. Basically, a heap of stones, although it did have what you see in some of the Welsh mounds, which are the drainage. There's drainage spouts out of I think, three sides of the tomb. You can no longer enter the tomb because it was collapsing. So they have done some structural things to hold it up. But the critical issue is the glyph, the hieroglyph that is scratched on the wall, engraved on the wall as you enter into the tomb. Now, you have to keep a couple of things in mind. When you talk about geoglyphs, there's a positive glyph and a negative glyph. The positive glyph is something built on, like maybe a standing stone or maybe a megalith or some kind of an artifact, whereas a negative glyph is something that is inscribed, a negative petroglyph. And this is what we see. And in this glyph gives us, yeah, that's the tomb there. There you go.
On the
And you can see where the fellow is standing there in front of the door.
Mhm.
That is the door that is now a barred entrance. You cannot enter because the tomb is collapsing.
Oh, okay.
But you can stick your camera right inside. You can put your phone in there and take a picture
Yeah,
of
I
it.
remember you saying that last week. Yeah.
Yeah, and here is the hieroglyph, right? And the
Mhm.
glyph. I saw the glyph pictures of the glyph years ago, and it didn't make any sense to me at all. But the glyph now has been interpreted by several people. But one of the interpretations I think is really kind of valid.
Mhm.
Number one, we find in a lot of megaliths, we find cosmological dating. For instance, if you look at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey,
Mhm.
when they first unveiled Göbekli Tepe, they looked at it and said, "What are these birds on these stones? You know, how does that make any sense to anybody?" Well, finally, when a historian looked at it and said, "These are constellations," you know, how we always put it as the crab or maybe the lion or maybe the woman or whatever it is, Orion's belt. In the ancient world, they didn't use that. They used birds to depict the various constellations.
Right.
So these birds, and so by interpreting the birds against the constellations in the sky, they were able to get an approximate date as to Göbekli Tepe, which is roughly 10,000 years old from today,
Mhm.
which would put it in a period of time called the Younger Dryas. In other words,
Mhm.
it was a pre-Adamic, antediluvian historical artifact.
Mhm.
Now, the mound in Jeremiah's tomb appears to give a date based upon the constellations in the sky that are given in a glyph, together with a solar eclipse, depicts a date of this scholar has determined was 581 BC. Now, 581 BC is totally consistent with the biblical narrative. We
Mhm.
know in the Bible that Jeremiah, of course, was cast into a cistern, and because Zedekiah, the king, didn't want to hear from him. And his scribe, whose name was Baruch, but in
Mhm.
the Irish manuscript, they describe him as Brug, but he was known as Baruch. And Baruch was instructed to give a manuscript to Zedekiah. He did, and so on and so forth. Zedekiah burned it again. And of course, Zedekiah died. He was killed by Nebuchadnezzar's men. But the daughters escaped. Now, if you read more of Jeremiah, you'll see that there was a movement that Jeremiah told them, "Stay here. We have vineyards, we have olive groves. Just take over the farms of the rich people that got taken away, and we can live here." They tried to do it. Somebody tried to make himself the leader. There was a revolution, a civil war that went on, and ultimately they decided, "We're not going to stay here. We're going to go into Egypt." And so this is the discussion that they went into Egypt. Now, from there, you get the legendary material. And the legendary material is that Jeremiah went into Egypt, and he went in with all three of Zedekiah's daughters. The youngest, her name was Tamar.
Mhm.
They called her Tia Tefi, but Tia Tefi in the Gaelic means tender twig, tender twig. And so this glyph depicts think it's 5 people leaving from Egypt, going to Gibraltar, and then only 4 people arriving in Ireland. Anyway, this is on the glyph.
Mhm.
And so the question is, what does the scholarship show? Now, one of the best scholars on this topic is a guy named Charles A.L. Totten, and he wrote 10 books called Our Race, and there's 10 books on it. And
Mhm.
he was a professor at Yale University and a former colonel in the U.S. military, writing in the 19th century. And he did a great deal of research and found, and this is what is so important to what we're talking about here in Britishism, is that uh, if you don't mind me giving this, I know this is kind of elaborate, Paul, but I got to kind of go back and set the stage for this. Okay.
Sure.
Okay. So, the Torah provides in the ancient manuscript that the firstborn is the primogenitor. And Moshe would say, well, look, the firstborn gets a double portion, and then every other heir gets a single portion. But that was not the case before you came to Israel, or Yaakov, Yasharel. That was not the case. Before that, Abraham gave 100% of his estate to his son Yitzchak. Yitzchak gave 100% of his estate to his son Yaakov. But Esau stole the whole estate. He stole the whole thing. That's why
Right.
Yaakov was 20 years up with Laban, right?
Mhm.
All right. Now, Yaakov in Genesis 49 is going to break up his birthright among the 12, well, actually 14 children. And Joseph, notably, is given a huge blessing. And Joseph is given the birthright to the land, to the Holy Land. Joseph is, not Judah.
Mhm.
Judah is given this right of he would have a scepter in his hand and a lawgiver between his feet, and he would rule over his brethren. So the gift to Judah is the gift of kingship. Now, Judah was a slob. I mean, just to tell you point blank, he was really not a very pleasant person. He was the one that wanted to kill Joseph when he was a kid. And he was the one, they sold him into slavery. He was the one that lied to his dad about him being killed by an animal. Notwithstanding his dad's grief, he kept the lie up for years. And then you read the narrative that Judah took a Canaanite woman to be his wife, took her. Okay, she has 3 sons. He brings this girl home. None of the 3 sons will touch her. Ultimately, Judah is going up to shear sheep. He tries to pick up a prostitute. He does pick her up. Turns out that it's his daughter-in-law, Tamar.
Mhm.
And Tamar gets pregnant, and she's immediately very well pregnant because she's pregnant with twins. Now, the narrative of the birth of these twins is what is so important to British history, and this is critically important.
Right.
Okay, so in the Torah, the first to break the matrix is the firstborn. So this is what happened. A hand comes out, the midwives tied a red ribbon around the hand. The hand withdraws, and the child without the red ribbon is born. The child with the red ribbon is the firstborn. And this is actually expressed in the Hebrew when you see their names. The child with the red ribbon was called Zerach, which means your seed.
Mhm.
The child that came out first, however, was called Perez, which is from the word paratz, which means to breach, to break forth, to
Mhm.
explode, right? Paratz.
Mhm.
Well, Perez is going to be the line of Mashiach. That's David, that's Solomon. They're all in that line. But
Mhm.
what about Zerach? Well, Zerach is the scapegoat. Okay, because when you get to the Feast of Yom Kippur, there are 2 goats chosen. One is going to be sacrificed, the other one is going to have a red ribbon put around its neck and sent into the wilderness. And this is the story of Zerach. He had a ribbon put around his wrist and essentially sent into the wilderness. And so it's very difficult to follow the genealogy of Zerach. There's no history on Zerach in scripture. We do know that his children were widely respected. His sons were widely respected and considered very wise men. The secular record shows that one of his sons, Calcol, was the founder of Athens. Another one of his sons, Darda, was the founder of Troy. Another
Wow.
one of his sons, Ethan, who wrote Psalm 89, Ethan, ended up founding Carthage and Cadiz, Spain, and
Wow.
became the leader of a very substantial people group that's now based mainly in Bulgaria and Romania. But Haman was the leader of this group. They were known as the Bulgs back then, but Bulgars, Balkars, Belgians,
Mhm.
Belgique.
Mhm.
Anyway, this was under Haman. So the whole of the House of Zerach, and this is what Charles A.L. Totten makes a very extensive discussion of. The pharaohs in Egypt were overtaken by the house of Esau. These were the sons of Esau from Seti the first through Ramses the 10th, sons of Esau. And the house of Zerach was in constant interface with these sons of Esau until there was a massive migration, the massive migration into Galeathus. Galeathus came into the Spanish, the Iberian Peninsula, the Ebruian Peninsula. That's where you get Iberia. It's from
Mm-hmm.
Ebru, the Ebruian Peninsula. And he entered into a place called Lusitania. Lusitania, they formed a city there, a port city. And this was the port of Galeathus or Portugal. Portugal.
Mm-hmm.
These people would also become in the north, embedded in the northern part of Spain, known as the Basque people,
Mm-hmm.
and the people in western France, known as the Gauls. And they would all, and the Gauls. It's very interesting because there is a megalithic record of standing uncut stones, substantial megalithic record in far western France that was dealing with the transient of pilgrims coming through Gaul of France and coming into Cornwall, coming into Wales. So, and then the Gaelic people would come into Ireland and ultimately Scotland. Okay, but according to A.L. Totten, the first king of the House of Zerach came out of Spain and he became king in Ireland, Yoked the Harriman. And it was Yoked the Harriman from the House of Zerach who would marry Tia Tefi, the last of the House of Zedekiah. And the two houses came together in Ireland and they would build a new capital city. And this capital city was called Tara. Now, this is another megalith that you can
Mm-hmm.
visit, Tara, in
Yeah.
Ireland. And of course, everything is gone now, but you can see how they would have held a fortress on this place with these hills and would have built their various buildings. Well, the key now, here's something else that is evidence that this occurred. And you have to go in and look at the Brehon system, or the system of the Druids at the time. The Druids was a foreign name. It was actually given to them from the French, Druis, which meant planted oak.
Mm-hmm.
Plant,
Yeah.
well, planted oak is very interesting because, again, you see this idea at the end of the book of Joshua, where Joshua took an uncut stone, planted it under a huge oak tree, uncut. And he said, this stone represents the fact that you consented to do all that Yah had told you to do in the Torah, which is the 10 Commandments. Okay. You consented to those. This stone is a relic of that. So the Druid practice would be to set up standing stones under an oak tree. And the idea of setting up the standing stones under an oak tree was to give credence to the fact that the commandments, the 10 Commandments, were binding law in the Druid system. Now, they weren't always binding law. Before the arrival of Tia Tefi, Jeremiah, and Baruch. And see, a lot of people say, oh, he can't be Olam Fadla because Olam Fadla had a record that went back farther than that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Olam Fadla just means wise man. It just means wise man. So he took the title of wise man, the ancient wise man, and Baruch was with him, called Baruch. And anyway, this marriage takes place. Well, when the marriage took place and they named their kingdom Tara after the Torah,
Mm-hmm.
Tara, there
Mm-hmm.
was a world of change because the reign of the Tua the Danim, which was of the house of Dan,
Mm-hmm.
we can deal with some of that. The Tua the Danim, that reign came to an end. It was a serpent worship based religion. Although when you say it came to an end, it really didn't, because you know the Ouroboros, right? The Ouroboros, which is the snake eating its own tail in a circle.
Mm-hmm.
That Ouroboros is oftentimes seen on the Christian cross, whether it's in Wales or in Ireland or in Scotland. You see the
Yes.
circle behind the cross, right?
Yeah.
And some people say, well, that was the sun behind the cross or a halo. But other people say, no, that was the Ouroboros. Now, I did see the Bible that was given to Richard II, and this was a Bible from the 1200s. And in that Bible, there was a picture, a hand-drawn picture of an Ouroboros in that Bible. And it also contained, by the way, the gospel according to Nicodemus.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in King Richard II's Bible. Very interesting. So, at any rate, so the serpent worship was put aside. The Torah came forward, and in particular, the Ten Commandments came forward, and they came forward as part of the Brehon system, the system of judges.
Hmm.
So when you see the standing stone circles, like there's some really brilliant examples in Wales, really good examples, where you have the 12 stones, you also have the rocking stone, and you also have the Logan stone. This is the
Hmm.
Logan gift, rocking stone for decision making. So the Brehon would he would lean back on the stone when he was listening to you talk. Then he would lean forward on the stone when he was giving his decision.
Yeah.
The decision was predicated upon the Torah, using that as the system of law, and then that would become the English common law. So one of the hard evidences you have
Hmm.
that this occurred is the English common law, because you do not have the English common law on the continent. When you get into Europe, that's all Napoleonic code. It's a completely different animal. The
Hmm.
common law is still reigns supreme in the British Isles, both in Ireland and England, although there are distinguishment between the Irish common law and the British common law, because the Magna Carta was not necessarily applicable there. So, at any rate, so that's another indication that this, in fact, did take
Hmm.
place. And finally, there's another third kind of conclusion you can reach, which was the acceptance of the faith when it was brought into the British Isles in 36 AD. It was brought into a system that had been practicing the Torah as its common law for 6 centuries at that point.
Hmm.
6 centuries.
Hmm.
Now, one of the tenets of the common law, the three tenets of the common law are this: it springs from time out of mind, it's manifestly reasonable, and it was subject to consent. Those are the three tenets of the common law. Well, that all points back to the Ten Commandments. And this is really the Eben Rosh Pina. This is the stone of offense, the stone of stumbling, because the king is subject to the common law. The parliament is subject to the common law. Every
Hmm.
judge is subject to the common law. And they can pretend they're not. They all do now.
And they do, yeah.
But they're nonetheless, they will lose all authority, and the nation itself will become very, very troubled when it
Mm.
moves away from the common law. The common law is the great blessing in the British Isles. I mean, it is the great blessing in the British Isles.
Mm.
If Henry VIII had subjected himself to the common law, the Anglican practice would have been much stronger than what it is. But
That's interesting.
you're reading that book on John Dee, right? And John Dee being the advisor to Elizabeth I.
Hmm.
And John Dee tried to come in and do some things. Elizabeth I's letter to the Pope discussing Augustine, calling him she calls him Austin, and she talks about what kind of problems he brought to the
Mm.
British Isles. Okay, so let's go back to the historical record now and talk about this a little bit more. Because we know that when you deal with the ancient history, there's very little. There's Gildas from the 7th century, and then you don't have any really serious narrative until the 14th century dealing with British history. Some of the stuff written in Rome, although there is a few good things. For instance, the speech of Caradoc in
Hmm.
Rome. That's a very strong record, very powerful record.
Yep.
And you have some of the writings of Julius Caesar and others trying to describe the Druids.
Hmm.
However, you have to remember Julius Caesar was trying to demonize the Druids
Yes.
because they were the intellectual foundation of all Europe at that time.
Mm.
In addition to practicing the Torah, they were also major scholars in astronomy, in botany, in geometry, in music. And I found it interesting that manuscript you were showing here with the opening of the show, that Merlin, Taliesin, presented himself at Arthur's court as a harpist.
Hmm.
You read that, right?
Yeah.
And we know that really in the Druid practice, that before you could become an archdruid, you had to go through the process of being a bard. And the Druids took the position that nothing should be in writing. This is why it's, again, very, very difficult to prove the narrative,
Hmm.
because there's no writing.
Mm.
And instead, what you have the idea of triadic teaching. So they would
Yes.
teach in threes, and what they would do is they'd teach in threes, but they would sing the premises. They would sing the premises. And so because of this, they were able to carry forward by memory all of these things. And they had a tremendous knowledge base, and the Druids were typically unarmed, and they would get up and judge the people. And I can tell you that when you talk about a civilization is civilized because of its judges, not because of its kings, not because of its electors, but because of its judges. If the judges have no integrity, your civilization is shot. It's gone.
Mhm. Mhm.
If you have judges with integrity, as what these Brehan system was a very well perfected system, 20 years of study to become an archdruid, to be able to stand on that stone and render a decision, right?
Mhm.
And those decisions had to be manifestly reasonable. They had to be predicated on a law that existed from time out of mind and that was at one time subject to consent.
Mhm.
Those things had to happen. So, so when we start looking at some of the other record, now let's get into some of the other record about this. So this is uh, there's other megaliths in Ireland that are worthy of also fantastic consideration, which is Newgrange,
Mhm.
and Newgrange is a UNESCO site, and there are basically three mounds there. Newgrange being the big one,
Mhm.
and then of course there's Knowth. Now, from my view, Knowth is more important than Newgrange,
Okay.
but the two of them together testify like you would not believe. Now let me show you what I saw in the testimony when I visited those sites. First of all, when you look at a megalith that's like a mound and it was buried, well, how do you know what was there? Right, it was buried. You dug all this dirt out, and then what? You know. Well, one of the things that proved to them that they knew it was a mound was several things. One, they found the stone circle surrounding it, the base, and the other was they found the cavern that was 40 feet long that had been protected and that was still present, still arched up. So then when they uncovered the entirety of it, that white stone look you see in the front of it was an
Mhm.
attempt for the archaeologists to put that back there. It didn't. That isn't how they found it. They put that back there. But the cavern did exist, and the stones, which are huge, surrounding the circle, those were present. All right. So if we take those two artifacts, we say, okay, this is the megalith in its true entirety. What do we see? Well, you have 52 stones
Mhm.
that are roughly 10 feet long by 4 feet high by about 6 feet wide, virtually immovable, right? You have 52 of those in a circle. Why would they put 52 there? Because they represented the 52 weeks of the year.
Yeah.
And then the cavern illuminates on the winter solstice. So
Mm.
this is projecting a 52 7-week year
Mhm.
with 365th day on the winter solstice. That's what's projected in Newgrange. That's
Yeah.
what you reason and see what's there. Now, when you get to Knowth has all kinds of petroglyphs, negative petroglyphs, all over the stones at its base. And Knowth, on the other hand, has two caverns, and both of those caverns predict the autumnal and the vernal equinox, sunset and sunrise. Both of them do. There's actually another log megalith they found out there too that does the same thing.
Mhm.
What's critical about the glyphs on Knowth, I mean, there's some fantastic glyphs there, Paul. You got to see it to believe it. Like there's one of the glyphs, for instance, predicts the sun and 10 planets. 10, not 9. This means they knew of Pluto, right? They knew of Pluto and they knew of the
Yeah.
planet that was destroyed, Rehav. Rehav was destroyed between Mars and Jupiter.
Right.
Of course, I forget the fellow who wrote Hidden Knowledge concerning Stonehenge, but Stonehenge projects an algorithm that depicts the mean for all of the orbits of 10 planets.
Mhm.
So now an asteroid belt was in that orbital plane. Okay, so you have that. That's one of the glyphs. There, you have another glyph that predicts a 29.5 day moon cycle
Mhm.
and its relationship to the sun cycle. And you have another glyph that, when I first saw it, it looks like this, right? And so you're looking at the squirrely snake. And of course, our archaeologist tour guy said, yeah, we think they were doing mushrooms when they did this. And I'm like, really, you think that's an explanation? I recognized it right off the bat for what it was, because I teach on this calendar idea all the time, which is that the day begins in the ancient calendar, the day begins when the sun sets,
Mhm.
because that's when the day ends. And so the day begins where the day ends. And so it begins when the sunset. And so you would draw it like this. Okay, sunset, here's the beginning of the day, and here's the rest of the day, right? This is when it's light, this is when it's dark, right? So here I'm looking at this glyph, and here it is like this, scratched in the stone, and it's exactly 7 of these. Okay. So here's this glyph on this stone telling you that they kept a 7-day week in the ancient world, going back to 4,500 years ago. They kept this 7-day week. And you've got 2 evidence, you got 2 witnesses. Here's a 7-day week etched on this stone, and 52 stones standing in a circle at New Grange, telling you 52-week calendar, 7-day week. And they had not only did they have knowledge of the moon cycle and the sun cycle, but they knew what's called the matamic. So the matamic is the moon reconciles with the sun. In other words, it gets back to its original position once every 18 years and 4 months. And they knew this. They had scratched that on a stone at Nauth.
Yeah, incredible.
Yeah, so these kinds of artifacts, those megaliths, and for all the megaliths I've seen in throughout Britain, these are the most impressive in terms of if you know what to look for. They're the most impressive because you will see things that just really give you a clear indication of what they were. And when you realize that they had 10 planets set forth in this stone, it also infers that they had lenses. Okay, and we've concluded this. We've kind of concluded this in our studies that there were lenses. There were big telescopes that were being used at that time.
Sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Pidgeon, but I've heard recently, I'm trying to remember who was saying it, but there are John Neal, that was it. There are loads of these lenses and telescopes and things underneath various museums. The new museum in Egypt, for example, they're well known about, but they're kept hidden for some reason, it would seem.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. And the reason why it doesn't surprise me, like I'll give you an example from the Bible. When you look at the book Revelation, the Apocalypse, you have this discussion that goes on in chapter 2 and chapter 3 of the 7 churches, Laodicea, Smyrna, Sardis, Philadelphia, etc., and Ephesus. Well, those churches, there are archaeological evidence of all 7 of those churches. So you can, for instance, you can go and map them out on Google Earth if you wanted to. They're all in the western part of the Anatolian Peninsula in Turkey. Now, when you do map them out, they compare geographically almost exactly with the 7 stars of the Pleiades.
Yeah.
But we didn't know about the 7th star in the Pleiades until the 1920s. The telescope called Subaru was invented.
That's right.
So they had a scope in the ancient days that allowed them to see these things. And the Pleiades, of course, are discussed in the book of Job. So here you begin to see this kind of tie-in record between these megaliths that are in Ireland, what the practice was. So we can see a 7-day week, a 52-week calendar year. We can see recognition of the winter solstice and the vernal and autumnal equinox. So all of those things are important. There's another artifact that was found in France called the Coligny calendar.
Yes. Yep.
And the Coligny calendar is actually a great artifact because it had been broken, but only in one place, and they were able to put the disc back together to recreate the calendar. And what they see is, of course, the biblical calendar, a calendar that begins in March, and a calendar that's predicated on the new moon, that has a 13th intercalary month that appears about every 3 years. There's a 13th intercalary month. And so you can see the reconciliation of the moon cycle to the sun cycle, the recreation of the year around the vernal equinox. All of those things are present in this Coligny calendar. Okay, so we've got some pretty strong evidence as to the calendar. We've got pretty strong evidence as to the birth of the common law being born out of the 10 Commandments and Moshe's teaching. And that came to England somehow. How did it get here? Well, we know that it had precedence in the Brehon system because this is what they were doing. And the Brehon system continued until you see Joseph of Arimathea arrive. And when Arimathea arrives, his narrative, which is the testimony of Mashiach, is accepted. It is accepted inside the Brehon system. And it's very interesting because, I told you about the triad stuff, right? So they used to do this with fingers, right? They would show 3 fingers like this to give their triadic teaching. Now, I'm kind of like the South Africans. I like three like this. No, South Africans do three like this. That's it.
Okay.
South Africans do three like this. Germans do three like this, like this. I prefer this because I can't hold my little finger down, you know. But the Druids would use three fingers because they referred to the creator as Iao, Iao, Iao. And so this was also very interesting because in the King James, for instance, Psalm 68, verse 4, the King James writers say his name is Iah, I-A-H, Iah.
Mm-hmm.
And so, very, very interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Now, you were mentioning something earlier about these Welsh stones, this museum in Wales that is full of stones.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let me ask you a question. Is there Colburn inscribed on these stones?
Oh, that's a good question. In this book written by Adrian Gilbert, he hasn't mentioned as of yet anything about Colburn, so I can't say yes or no. I can't confirm that. I don't know.
Well, Colburn is extremely fascinating. Old
Mm-hmm.
King Cole was a very merry old soul, right? Old King
Yep.
Cole, right? And the so-called Colburn Bible contains a book in there called the Coel book. So the Colburn Bible binds all these things together, but the Coel book is really quite a fascinating discussion, and it too describes the narrative of what took place during the time of the Exodus, men's hearts failing for fear for what they saw coming on the earth, and so on and so forth. Really very descriptive and a very good.
This is not the same as the Colburn,
It's
is
the
it?
same narrative. The Colburn contains the Coel book.
Right.
Coel,
Okay. Yeah.
one part
Yeah.
of the Coel. It's the
Yeah.
last third, maybe. But yeah, both of them are very good reads and very important in terms of telling us what happened. So when you talk about this, what took place on the Isle, so we can see that the Brehon system was so intellectual and so advanced that it began to influence the continent. And the Brehons were imported into Germany, and they were imported into Central Europe and into France, and they were making decisions because they were just judges. They knew what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
And the common law, of course, when they make a decision based on the common law, the people would find it perfectly reasonable because it was perfectly reasonable, right? But the Romans were infuriated with this idea because the Romans, of course, wanted to control the narrative. Look, we put in an aqueduct, we built a road, obey us, right? And that whole idea of the Roman supremacy is a spiritual battle I won't get into right now, but I'll just put it this way: the Romans stem from the house of Esau, and they are they're still looting the estate of Yaakov, of
Okay.
Jacob.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
How are you spelling Esau? Sorry.
Well, I actually pronounce it Esu.
Esu. Yeah.
E-S-U, Esu. And in the Hebrew, it's spelled Ein Sin Vav. And but anyway, it is at any rate when you look at this narrative. I mean, that's another part of the narrative. But the main thing I wanted to point out is that this idea of the scepter in the hands of Judah, the birthright to the king, and the lawgiver at his feet, this came to join together with the marriage of Tamar, the daughter of Zedekiah, called Tiatet, and Yoked the Hermon, the first High Irish king of the line of Zerach. So Zerach and Peretz came together to create this line of kings. Now, how much evidence do we have of that? Well, good luck. Prove Yoked the Hermon. I mean, but there's a point where I think that you have to look at the narrative. If there's a narrative going on, why did they create the narrative? Why is this story being told? And why is it being told elsewhere? Like, for instance, in Cornwall, there's discussion. And did these feet in ancient times walk upon Britain's mountains green? And was the Holy Lamb of God, right, on Britain's hills seen, right? So when you talk about this, the Cornish tell this tale. And they have ancient songs. I saw three ships and all this kind of stuff. Those were the three ships of Joseph of Arimathea.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow.
Oh, yeah.
That's interesting. Okay.
So there's a legend that at Mara Zion, which is the island which is right off right off the beach at Penzance, at the far end of the Cornwall. At Penzance, there's an island called Mare Zion, and this is something that, again, here's something that is like, what? What are you talking about? Okay, so there is a monastery of Saint Michael off the far western coast of Ireland. Okay, and then if you draw a direct line, straight line from that to Mare Zion, where there is the monastery of Saint Michael on top of that island,
Mm-hmm.
you can continue on that straight line, and it will go right over the top of Mount Saint Michel in France, and two other monasteries named after Saint Michael in Italy, one near the Swiss border and one south of Naples.
Mm-hmm.
So we have 5 of these monasteries named after Saint Michael in a row. Now, we followed that line out, contrary to the legend. We took that line out because we can do it now, modern mapping. And it does not connect with Jerusalem at all.
Okay.
It connects with a city on the Mediterranean coast in Egypt. And finally, the last monastery near Lake Tana in Ethiopia.
Right.
But how is it that these monasteries are on a perfect ley line?
Mm.
How is it? How'd that happen?
Mm.
That this happened, right?
Mm.
And so you've got more evidence of some really strong stuff. Now, the legend of Mare Zion is quite interesting. This is an island that has the brick pathway going out to it. And so low tide comes, you can walk out there. But you better get back during the bottom of low tide, because you don't think you're going to go back with the tide coming in. There have been so many people that have been washed out with that tide coming in.
Yeah, sure.
It comes in quickly, right? But the legend there in Cornwall is that Mashiach and Arimathea were stuck on that island for 3 months. They couldn't get off the island because of high tides and et cetera. And so that's one of the discussions. There's other discussions that there was a well built that they used to use in the 1st century that they believe was being used by that pair.
Mm-hmm.
There's a ton of paintings and the folklore and the legend and the mythology. And of course, Arimathea controlled the Ding Dong mine, which is the oldest tin mine in the world, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he controlled that. He controlled that mine. So he was well known. And there's a whole bunch of information on this. There's ancient verses that the miners used to say, ancient greetings that the miners used to say, ancient songs that the miners used to say, all concerning this Arimathea and his son. Now, the legend that I find no support for whatsoever is Glastonbury. Okay. I just don't find any support for Glastonbury.
Yeah.
Glastonbury is a Knights Templar place that was built in the 9th and 10th century. And I really think that area of Somerset was actually underwater.
Yeah, most people do, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, it was underwater. But where the Tor is on top of the Tor on top of the mountain,
mm-hmm.
that wasn't built. I think that was built in 980 AD. 980.
Okay, so if it's that recent, it must be a natural hill, and they've developed it. They've built tunnels inside it. Are you saying it's not actually a man-made structure as such, is it?
Well, the hill, no. I think the hill is natural, and
Yeah.
the hill looks over the valley of Somerset. Great place to put a monastery or to put a tower or to put whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very kind of common in the ancient world. So I think that's that, but it doesn't have an existence. It goes back more than about to 900 AD. Sometime in the 10th century, that was put up, as far as it can tell. But when you're talking about the abbey and all that's built down in Glastonbury, no, that's later. And the legend of Arthur and Guinevere being buried there was made up in order to buy a new roof.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And
all that kind of thing,
Yeah.
And when you're talking about the Cornish legends hold a lot more weight, in my opinion, because they have folklore associated with them. Now, let's talk about this for a minute, because what other culture anywhere else talks about the young Messiah being there? No one else. No one else in the world. They don't say it in Egypt. There's no discussion in Egypt saying, oh, yeah, he was here. Even though they went to Egypt for a while, there's no discussion of that.
Well, I suppose we have the French believe that Mary Magdalene went to France, don't they?
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think Mary Magdalene and her husband, who I think was Lazarus, Elazar, the one raised from the tomb.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do agree with that. They entered Marseille.
Have you seen this book, Dr. Pidgeon? The Life of St. Mary Magdalene and her sister, St. Martha. written by Rabbinus Marcinus, I think his name was. It was written in the 9th century, and it's the very first chronicle of Mary Magdalene coming to France with her entourage.
Mhm.
I do believe that's where the book that came out in the 80s, The Holy Blood, Holy Grail, got a
Yeah.
lot of its info from this.
Uh-huh.
This is a very interesting read.
I think that's fascinating stuff. And of course, Mary Magdalene was a very powerful disciple. She was a very powerful disciple. No one wants to talk about it because we only talk about the men. But who was at the cross? It was the women that were at the cross, right? The men at all. Let's get out of here.
Yeah.
Let's get out of here. Yeah. But Arimathea now. There's some other hard evidence. One of the great evidences of Arimathea's arrival is the Doomsday Book, right? William the Conqueror's Domesday Book, that details in that book the 12 hides of land that had transacted to Arimathea and his people. Now, Paul, I just got to share with you. When I was up in Anglesey, which was this time last year, I was up in Anglesey. And this book here, which is The Marian Conspiracy, I need to mirror the image. But anyway, The Marian Conspiracy by Graham Phillips. Okay.
Oh, I've heard of the author's name, yeah.
Yeah. In this book here, Graham Phillips went into the Vatican and he wanted to see what kind of material they had. And the discussion was he had met a monk there called Benedetti. And Benedetti had been a guy that was reading the archives. And so some of the questions were concerning, was there more than one tomb for Mary? Now, here's what happened. The Catholic Church would take a position pretty early on. It wasn't a formal position, but it was a position nonetheless that Miriam had ascended to heaven. It's called the Assumption. Ascended to heaven. In fact, if you go in many of the Catholic churches right now, you see that image painted on the ceiling or painted on the wall or represented over the altar. Okay, now the difficulty with that is that you can't have a tomb of Mary, let alone two tombs of Mary, right? So this became a problem. So the church elected to move Mary out of any place where she could be found. And so I think this is the reason why the second tomb of Mary, which Graham Philip documents in this book, was on the island of Anglesey.
Wow.
Now, this gives us some reasons for a whole bunch of discussion because in first of all, if that's the case, then she was buried on the 12 hides of land belonging to Arimathea. Those 12 hides of land may have been on the island of Anglesey.
Wow.
And so anyway, so he goes up there, I think it was in 99. He went up there and he was like, and what had happened was she was buried, her bones were buried at this church in this little obscure town up north of the Straits of Menai. And then William the Conqueror entered into Britain in 1066. And when he entered in, the church freaked out. They said, they're going to find these bones. We've got to get these bones out of here. So they took Mary from the church and they put her into this obscure tomb somewhere near this artesian well. So we went up, we heard of this legend. We heard of Graham Phillips' legend. And so we were in Menai. So we went, well, let's go see if we can find it. We found the church, and the church was just dead in a doornail. I mean, everybody in the graveyard was dead, the church was also dead, So anyway, but we walked the whole graveyard like, okay, well, we're not going to find anything here. So we came back into the street, and I said, well, let's go get some coffee somewhere. Let's find a coffee shop. And so we found this obscure coffee shop in an old train station. And when we came out from the coffee shop, here's this old, worn out, tired billboard sitting there. Looking for the tomb of Mary?
Wow.
Yeah, it was like that. You need to go to this museum, So we go down to the museum, and I'm like, hey, we're looking for the tomb of Mary. What do you got? And the curator says, oh, yeah, we've got something for you. We can show you. And they began to discuss their relationship with Graham Phillips and what had happened when Graham Phillips arrived. And it was Ian Jones, who was the curator up there. And Ian Jones, fantastic guy, brilliant guy, and knew his history really, really well. We sat down and started talking about Doggerland, right?
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah, which the North Sea was an agricultural area, right?
Yeah.
And at any rate, So we're talking about that, and then they said, "Well, look, do you want to see the headstone we found that Graham Phillips said he'd located, and
Hmm.
where he believed the tomb of Mary was?" I said, "Yeah, I want to see it." Okay, so we go chucking upstairs. He unlocks the filing room. We go into this place with all the filing cabinets lined up. Get into the back of the room. There on the bottom shelf, he pulls up this box and it's covered with cloth, and he pulls the cloth away, and here's this red granite stone with this M carved in it and a fish on the far leg,
Wow.
far end. So I'm sure, what do you guys think about that? And
Yeah,
they,
that's brilliant.
we spent all day. We went out there after Graham Phillips told us where it was. We went out there and looked, spent all day. It was 12 hours searching for this. And they finally found the stone.
Hmm.
And they got it in. Now, this stone was located at the head of an artesian well that, of course, forms a little stream. Then that stream becomes a creek. The creek becomes a river. The river becomes a lake. The lake is dammed. And it's a reservoir for all of the people on Anglesey,
Hmm.
stemming from really where the gravesite of Mary was. So it's an
Amazing.
absolutely fascinating story.
Yeah,
And
it really is.
a fascinating artifact. And
Hmm.
there's reason to believe that Miriam was there. For instance, we saw another headstone that appeared to be a woman headstone that was used for offering. It was like a Logan stone. You put your offering on the stone. But at any rate, so these are the kind of artifacts that we see. And so the Domesday Book pointing to Anglesey, the idea that the Druids were there in Anglesey as their last bastion. This is where the slaughter happened.
Hmm.
That Dacia would rise up and kill 70,000 Romans because of what they did to the Druids,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And the practice of the faith at that time. So with the Ramathea coming in and saying, okay, well, the my grandson that you guys all knew that I'd introduced you to, he was crucified in Jerusalem, and I was beaten 5 times by the Sanhedrin, and so we left, and here we are. And so he
Hmm.
arrived with a group of 12 because there were 12 hides given.
Right.
And so because of this, so you have the Domesday Book, you have the Tomb of Jeremiah, you have Nouth, Douth, and Newgrange. You have this tombstone of Miriam. You have other artifacts on Anglesey that are kind of persuasive. And then there's many things in Cornwall that point to Mashiach being there. For instance, there is a statue of a baby, a young man, a boy on the cross in Cornwall. There's ancient villages. There's a well that they believe was in operation at that time, and then of course there's all the verse, all the phrases, all the sayings that
Hmm.
spring from time out of mind in Cornwall. All of these things are contributory evidence
Hmm.
of what I'm saying.
Yeah, well, that's a fantastic answer. Brilliant. There's so much to look into there with what you've told me. So much. So that's brilliant. We're already an hour in, and I've asked you one question. So we,
Oh,
we
sorry
best,
about that.
yes, all right. We best press on quickly. I'll just quickly share a comment that we've received from a guy called Andrew Christie. Hello, Andrew. He says the chamber tombs known as bra or womb were built to look like the female generative organ. Their alignment with the solstices and equinoxes at sunrise are or setting echoes conception and birthing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I see that. Yep.
yeah.
Yeah. And
I,
they were considered chamber tombs, by the way. I think they found evidence of human bones
mhm,
inside of Newgrange at the end of that 40-foot passage. Yeah.
yeah, okay. Avebury as well, I think, is all to do with fertility as well. Okay, let's move on quickly now because we're well into our time. So let's move on to early Christianity in Britain. So in our last discussion together, you stated that the Har-Ramathean Church was very different to the Church of Peter and the Church of James the Just. So what I would like to know is how did the teachings of Jesus become splintered so early, and what would Jesus have made of it all?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Paul. And I mean, I can tell you that, one of the things you see in the Gospels is you see this idea of the duties, right? Feed the hungry, clothe the naked, take care of the widow, take care of the orphan, visit those in prison. Okay, so those are duties. They're nothing you're going to receive a reward for. Those are things you are required to do.
Mhm.
Well, does that translate into all things common among men? So Peter, when he formed the church at Antioch, he formed a communist
Mhm.
church. It was very much communist. From each according to his ability, to each according to his need, all things common among men.
Was
And
Peter in Essene? Sorry to interrupt you. Was Peter in Essene? Because the Essene philosophy was very similar to communism, wasn't it?
yeah, very much so.
Mhm.
But the thing is, when you talk about the Essenes, there's a great set of books by a guy named Eisenman. He
Professor
teaches,
Eisenman, yeah, I know.
yeah, he teaches at Hebrew University, and he's a very strong scholar on the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Mhm.
And he believes the Dead Sea Scrolls were actually crafted by the team that was under Yaakov Sadiq or James the Just.
Right, okay.
But James the Just had created, it was a communist order, but it was really a monastic order. And so you would see the monasteries very much following that protocol. They had the community rules in Qumran that's in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And if you read those community rules, you can see very much so this was a communist monastery, is what it was.
Mhm.
Now, Peter tried to do it among husband and wife, all things common among men. And, the couple that withheld the real estate dropped dead. And when that happened, when both of them died, it says that a terror came upon the people. Now, Peter did not remain in that church in Antioch. He left with John Mark and he went to what is now Cairo, but at that time was called Fortress Babylon. This is detailed in 2nd Peter. And so he went to, and he was dying in Fortress Babylon. I don't believe he ever set foot in Rome. I think he died in Cairo. That's what I think. But anyway, so his attempt to establish a communist church failed. The monastery at Qumran would ultimately fall apart. They would move for persecution and so on and so forth, and it did not last. But they did preserve the texts in the scrolls. Arimathea, on the other hand, arrives back in Britain. Now, his wife was from Cornwall, and she was the mother of Mary.
Are we talking about Anna?
Yeah.
Yep, yep.
She was also the sister of Elizabeth, the wife of Zachariah, the mother of John the Baptist.
Mm-hmm.
So Arimathea had married a Levite woman. She was a Levite woman born in Cornwall, and they had gone back to the Holy Land. And they were late. And the Gospel of Yaakov details this, okay, but it misidentifies the father, calling him Joachim instead of telling you that his name is Yosef. And the reason they did that, and this is because this was common among the Romans who created the New Testament when they wrote this down. You can see very clearly that Eusebius Hieronymus deleted things he didn't want in the text. There's an artifact called the Gospel According to the Hebrews, which is 22 deletions that Eusebius had made these notes in his own handwriting and elected not to put them in the scripture. He elected to leave them out.
Mm-hmm.
And and then, of course, names were changed to protect the innocent. And not only were names changed, but the names were given. I mean, who got married when the water was made wine? Who was that getting married? We don't know. Name isn't given. Who was the disciple whose father died and he needed to go bury his father? We don't know. Name's not given, right? So there were things that were just not given to us specifically that should have been. And Yosef, in order for you to understand a Bible without contradiction, Mashiach is called the Ben David, the son of David. That's verse 1, Matthew 1.
Mm-hmm.
You can't establish it in Matthew 1 because Matthew 1 in most English Bibles is about Joseph, the husband of Mary. Mary can't be counted in that litany because you don't count Bathsheba, who's mentioned. You don't count Tamar, who's mentioned. You don't count Rahab, who's mentioned. You don't count Ruth. All of those women are mentioned, but they're not in the count. You can't count Mary because she's not of the DNA, the generative line of Joseph. So you end up with 14, 14, and 13, and you can't link Mashiach to David because Joseph, the husband, was not the father. And that Joseph, the husband, in Matthew 1 is also the supposed father Joseph in Luke 3, and they have completely different genealogies. How do you make sense of this? Well, the way you make sense is by understanding that Miriam came under the authority of her father because Joseph had died very early on. There's no mention of Joseph after Mashiach's 12.
No.
Nothing, right? He died very early on. And so as a consequence, her man was her father, Joseph. And that Joseph, it's Joseph of Arimathea, who had the authority to get the body off the cross. You think about it. Somebody dies in your town and you're a rich guy. Hey, listen, I need the body. You're not going to get the body under Roman law. You had to be the patriarch of the family to get the body.
Mm.
And Arimathea gets the body. It tells you something. He was the grandfather.
So
And
if he was the grandfather of Jesus, then he would have come to Britain shortly after the crucifixion. He must have been at least in his late 60s, early 70s.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Okay.
And so the question is, how long did Arimathea live? And
Mm.
there were a number of people who were really quite advanced in age when they got here. How long did they live? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But we do know that when Arimathea comes back, he says, I'm leaving the Holy Land. We're going to go back, not to Cornwall, but rather to Wales. We're going to go back there and we're going to, reestablish ourselves there. Well, he had to face the Brehons. He had to face the Druids. And when he came into to the Druids and he gave the testimony of the Messiah, the Druids accepted it because, in my opinion, the Druids were the Magi who went and found the baby the day of his birth.
Mm-hmm.
Not 2 years later, they found him the following morning. They were there, and Mary was like, "What are you doing here? I'm still in I'm in my uncleanness. What are you doing here?" Oh yeah, here's some gold, here's some frankincense, here's some myrrh. Here you go. So she takes that and does what? Flees to Egypt, right?
Yeah.
And so anyway, so I believe that those were the Druids. So the Druids readily understood the narrative. They were expecting it. They understood all the prophecies because that had been taught for 500 years under the Brehon system.
Mm-hmm.
Taught, well understood. So it was accepted. So what did Arimathea bring? Well, first of all, Arimathea could not do what Peter did, and he could not do what James did, which is to form a communist order, because whatever he brought to the islands was subject to the common law.
Mm-hmm.
He could not offend the common law.
Mm-hmm.
And so but look at the difference. Messiah is testifying in the Holy Land, saying this is what the law really says. This is what the Torah really means. Man wasn't created to serve the Sabbath. Sabbath was created to serve the man. And clarifying these things. And they rejected him. When the narrative is brought to the British Isles, they accepted him.
Mm-hmm.
Two different narratives.
Yeah.
So when you look at the distinction between the Arimathean protocols and what James suggested, what Peter had done, the Arimathean protocols respected "thou shalt not steal."
Mm.
They respected the laws of inheritance. They respected the laws of dowry. They respected the laws of criminal law and the tort law and the civil law and all those things that are established in the Torah. They accepted.
Mm.
And that was part of the protocol. But what did Arimathea bring in? He brought in, first of all, the Sabbath. But I think they were Sabbath keepers before that. I don't know how ardently they were Sabbath keepers before that. There's not any real hard evidence to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
But with Arimathea coming in, he was a Sabbath keeper. He was also a feast keeper. He also kept the calendar. And so there was no Sunday church. That isn't going to be invented until 325 AD, the Sunday church. This was Saturday observance, Sabbath observance, and keeping the calendar. And the calendar is given evidence in the Colini calendar, which is just the name of the artifact that gives evidence to the calendar that was being kept. But again, we also have Newgrange and Knauth giving evidence to that very same calendar.
Mm.
The very same calendar.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is going to be protected for years. And you see this in the letter of Elizabeth I to the Pope, complaining about Augustine, who set up a camp in Canterbury.
Yeah.
And again, Augustine was ruthless. And he excommunicated all of the bishops that were in Wales at that time, in these well-established churches, because they refused to engage in the invocation of the saints. They refused to adopt the doctrine of transubstantiation, and they would not attend a Catholic Mass. So those three were like out. They were out of the question. And Augustine said, well, you're excommunicated. And then he had them all executed.
Wow.
And so Elizabeth writes a letter to the Pope saying, hey, we ask you for a shepherd. You sent us a wolf. That's what it says in that letter, Yeah. And so another very important artifact that goes to discuss what was going on with the church. Now, you run into some problems with the High Line of Kings, though, Paul, because, you have Yoke the Herman, and his line is going to exhaust with Edward the Bruce, who was the brother of Robert the Bruce. Robert Bruce was going to be the last defender of the Sabbath-keeping people in the North. So the practice of the Arimathean Church would spring up through the Welsh Peninsula, up through Anglesey, up into the Lakes region, and all the way into Scotland. So the guys that were on the island of Iona were practicing this methodology. And this is where the Book of Kells was written in Iona.
Is there anyone or any religious group that practices anything that closely resembles the Ramathian Church today?
Well, our group does.
Okay.
To the extent that we're not a defined group in any respect, but we are people who keep the Shabbat. We do keep the feast days, and we also follow that calendar. Of course, it's very difficult to follow a scriptural calendar when the whole world's on the Gregorian calendar. I mean, you can recognize the days. For instance, we just celebrated New Year's back here on the 28th. That was our New Year day. And so
sorry, why is it the 28th? Spring equinox is around the 21st to 23rd, isn't it?
Yeah. And so in this case, it was the new moon following the equinox, following the vernal equinox.
Right. Okay.
And so the new moon is predicated on the conjunction of the moon. And so you have the new moon, and the new moon is, so under the calendar, I'll just briefly go through it. So you have the new moon starts the month, and the first new moon is the beginning of spring. The second new moon is the beginning of summer. Fourth new moon, beginning of summer. Seventh new moon, beginning of fall. 10th new moon, the beginning of winter. It's different than the equinox, than the solar calendar, which is equinox solstice. And it's readjusted every year pursuant to the vernal equinox. So some years you have a 13th month intercalary month. And these all have names, by the way, in the Collini calendar. All those months are named in a Celtic name, not in a Hebrew name. And so at any rate, so that's basically, so it's a luni-solar calendar, and it's essentially an agricultural calendar. And so this is the rhythm that was being maintained by the Arimathean Church.
Okay, right. We're going to have to draw to a close very soon now because we're well over our time. I will ask you one more question. And I'd also ask you, would you consider coming back to do a part 3? Because
I would love to, Paul. I think you're absolutely brilliant. I love what your show is doing, and I think you're absolutely brilliant. I would love to. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, we'll stay behind after we finish, and we'll sort something out on that front. Okay, so my last question is to do with St. Paul for this evening. So, do you believe that St. Paul came to Britain? And if so, what language would he have preached into the ancient Britons? And I guess this could also apply to Joseph of Arimathea as well. When he came to Britain, how would he have communicated with people?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are great questions. And I mean, I know that whenever I do work in a foreign country, I usually use a translator. And I think Paul probably used a translator. I think Arimathea was conversant in the language. And of course, the language in Cornwall and Wales is both of those languages are very consistent. The Cymraeg is very similar to the ancient Cornish. And so they're able to, but they're distinct from Gaelic, right? The Gaelic and the Gaelic even in Ireland is different than the Gaelic in Scotland to some degree. But certainly the language of the Cymraeg and the Cornish languages are very similar. And he was conversant in that. He'd been running shipping there his whole life. He was running all those mines. He was running silver. He was running copper. He was running tin, all of that. Yeah. ChatGPT is Kufik, but couldn't read most of it. Yeah. It's very interesting. I mean, my understanding is that it was Cymraeg, or pronounced Cymraeg. And it comes from the Cymry, which is how the Welsh refer to themselves. Cymry. And we talked about that before. And next time we talk, maybe we can talk about the tribes and the migration.
Brilliant. Yeah, great.
Distinguish between Herbert Armstrong's British Israelism.
Yes.
And because there are facts that Armstrong did not want to admit, which is that there are many people in Britain who were not of the 12 tribes, right? That would help to know that, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And, but at any rate, so I think Paul, the evidence of Paul being in Britain is just unbelievable. I mean, there's so much evidence. The appointment of Aristobulus V as the Bishop of London, his teaching at Mount Lud. We know, for instance, when you leave off the narrative, if you don't include the Sonini manuscript, Sonini discovered this manuscript in Constantinople. He brought it back to King Louis XVI. 16th was being beheaded, took it to Ireland. it stayed in a peat bog for 100 years in Ireland. It's finally released, finally translated into English, and here they find out it's this narrative of Paul going to Spain, then
Mhm.
coming to Britain, and then going to Switzerland, and then going back to Macedonia.
Mm.
Okay, did he go to Spain? Oh, absolutely. You go into the Spanish records, you'll find he appointed bishops all over Spain, in Sevilla, Cordova, and Granada. He appointed bishops all over the place.
Mm.
And then when you see the record in Britain, I must have seen a half a dozen books talking about the journeys of Paul being in Britain.
Mm.
And they believe that he made one trip, came in through Mousehole, and another trip he entered through Plymouth. So he was not really treading on Aramathaean turf. He was
Right.
instead going to Mount Lude. He
Mhm.
was to New Troy that was
London.
formed in the Thames River, right?
Yeah.
And and that's where, and at Mount Lude, of course, that's where St. Paul's Cathedral is, sitting at the top of Lude Hill,
Yep.
and and running up there. Yeah. So I think, and again, I think it's not just the legends that support it.
Mm.
The Acts 29 in the Sonini manuscript, he talks about him going to Switzerland and to the mountain where Pontius Pilate committed suicide. Right?
Right. Okay.
Yeah. We'll talk to the Swiss. They know exactly what mountain that is.
Wow, that's a new one on me as well. Okay. This has been fantastic. By the way, my suspicion, my guess, uneducated guess, was that Paul communicated to the Britons in ancient Greek, because some people may have known Greek in those days. That was my guess, but you wouldn't go along with that, no?
Well, I mean, it's possible. It's really hard to say what the language was at that time, particularly in the London area, because of the people that had migrated there and had formed that township. They
Mm.
may have been fluent in the ancient Greek, but but Paul was using translators wherever he went, except when he was back in Jerusalem, standing trial on murder or standing trial for the death penalty, and he defended himself in Hebrew.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's finish up with a couple of comments. Andrew Christie is back with the new moon after the equinox was traditionally seen as the start of the new year, where a chart is drawn for the year ahead. It's still known as the Saka era calendar among Hindus.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
That's very
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I mean, it's written that way in the book of Enoch. In Enoch chapter
okay.
78, it tells you it's the first new moon after the equinox.
Right, brilliant. Okay. And Pendraig is back. Pendraig is the person that left that comment about Jesus on episode 2. Thank you for that, Pendraig. Cymry was originally spelled Cynmry. Then it was spelled
Cool.
Cymmry, and so on and so on. Cymry means the people of first existence.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
from my point of view, when I look at the Hebrew on the Qumri, I find it very interesting because they sprang out of the northern tribes that were dispersed in 722 BC. And I do not believe that they were actually part of the northern tribes, but rather they were the tribe of Joseph and the sons later born to Joseph. In other words, Joseph had two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. They were both anointed as heirs to Jacob or Israel. But he had, according to the book of Jasher, he had many other children with his wife Asenath in Egypt. And that was one of the tribes that sojourned with Moshe. They were the sojourners. It was the tribe of Joseph. And the tribe of Joseph retained the language of Egypt, and they came into the northern kingdom, but they were a distinct tribe. They weren't under the banners of Yasharel. They were sojourners with them, but they retained the language of Egypt, and they came under the leadership of a king named, in most scriptures, they call him Omri, but his real name was Umri, not Omri. And so Umri was the one who codified the law in the northern kingdom, and they would refer to the people like Umri. In the Hebrew is you put the kaf in front of the word to mean like. That's a prefix meaning like. Omri, like they were like Omri. Umri.
Right. Okay.
Umri.
That makes
And
sense.
then you see this migration. And so this is a very important tribe in Wales and in Cornwall. And because they were the tribe, and this is why, and this is another evidence going back to your question number one, Alan Wilson was able to decipher the black obelisk by applying the Welsh language to describe the hieroglyphs and pulling those out as alphabetic letters and then applying it to the obelisk. And boom, here's the whole story of Joseph in the black obelisk, right? There it is.
Yeah.
And So I think that is, and that's why I was asking about the Colburn, because the artifacts of Colburn, of course, it's extremely important history, that language being there, because that poor fellow that identified the Colburn language, they're still calling him a liar.
Yeah, I know.
Right.
Is that
And
Yulo Morganu?
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
and who named his son Taliesin, right? He
yeah,
named
that's
his son
right.
Taliesin, right?
Mm.
And yeah, but fantastic stuff. But so Kumrak, and I think I agree with what Pendragon was saying, that is means the people of first existence.
Mm.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
And
Okay, that's a great place to end it this evening. Thank you so much, Stephen. I've really enjoyed this. You've given me so much information, new information to look into and research. So thank you very much for that. Please stay behind for a minute after we finish up. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Next week, we've got on Adrian Gilbert, the author of The Holy Kingdom and The Blood of Avalon. Please like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you again next week. Thank you, Stephen, so much.